Okay, we're live.
Observations of the Biden-Moon Summit. What was said, what was not said, is the topic of this month's IMAP webinar. My name is Hans Moyer. I serve as a national coordinator for IMAP in North America. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins. Dr. Jenkins is president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the monthly Washington Brief webcast. He is also the chairman of the Washington Times Holdings Company. He has led numerous well-received fact-finding trips to Korea and Japan that have met with legislative, executive, intelligence, and military leadership of those countries. As president of the nonprofit NGO, the Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins has a decades-long involvement in starting and conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in Northeast Asia and the Middle East. Please help me welcome Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Hans. Welcome to our listening audience and viewing audience all over the world. We're very happy to be with you. The IMAP is the International Media Association for Peace. And Dr. Thomas Walsh is the chairman of UPF International, and he instituted the associations of UPF on media, business, politics, religion, and culture. And this is the seminar that we have every Tuesday at 2 p.m. And the focus of all of our associations right now is on North and South Korea and Northeast Asia. Is peace possible there? The International Media Association for Peace is a global association under UPF. We're very grateful for the leadership of our UPF team, Dr. Thomas Walsh, Dr. Taj Hamad, and myself as president. We work together, especially focused on the United States, which has the greatest responsibility there in Northeast Asia. We have expert panelists every week. We're very honored to present to you Mr. Bill Gertz today and Mr. Guy Taylor. Bill Gertz is a national security columnist for the Washington Times and is the author of 8 books, 4 of which were national bestsellers. Most recently are iWars, War and Peace in the Information Age, and Deceiving the Sky. And I want to recommend that everybody gets this book. This is quite a profound book on understanding China. It's very detailed, deeply researched. Bill's whole career has been focused on bringing out the truth and finding ways that America can actually properly relate with China and bring peace in the Northeast Asian sphere. So also that book is on Audible. I would highly recommend you go to Amazon to get it. I'm profoundly inspired by the facts and the issues that he's brought out. And many of the players in that book, which was also covering the Obama administration, some of the Trump administration efforts, but many of those players in the Obama administration are back now. And so it's very relevant. Also, Bill has been a guest lecturer of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia, and for the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Defense University, and also he has been with the Brookings Institute, as well as a former media fellow at the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace and at Stanford University. I'd like to welcome at this time one of the great columnists for the Washington Times, Mr. Bill Gertz.
Great, thank you, Michael. Appreciate that for that kind introduction. I'm just going to make a very few brief remarks, and then Guy will talk to a little bit, just a little recap on the recent summit meeting. The statement mentioned a shared commitment to the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, as well as to address the nuclear and missile programs from North Korea. Didn't emphasize the threat of those programs, but they are a real threat, not just to the region, but directly to the United States. Also, there was a cost-sharing agreement in March that was concluded that increased the South Korean share of defense spending on the 28,000 troops from about 30 to, or actually They wanted it to be 30 to 50% increase way back in the Trump administration, couldn't agree on that, backed off, and they finally came to terms on it. So the South Koreans are going to be paying probably a little bit more for the US troop presence there. The summit addressed the threat of the nuclear missiles and nuclear weapons from North Korea. This is again at the top of the security agenda in Northeast Asia for the United States. The Biden administration did recently a policy review on North Korea. Not a lot of granularity in terms of what types of new policies. They basically said that they were going to approach diplomatically and take it as it comes. And the president was asked at the press conference if he'd be willing to meet with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and said that he would be under certain conditions, the conditions being that North Korea would agree to give up its nuclear programs. So the Biden administration is going to continue the pressure campaign, which involves primarily sanctions on North Korea, sanctions that are designed to curb both of those missile and nuclear programs. I don't think those sanctions have been effective. The commander of US forces, the nominee for commander of US forces, Korea, General Paul LaCamera, recently testified and gave us a real good intelligence dump on the latest threats from North Korea. And he revealed, and if you were following the Washington Times, you would know that I wrote about this, that North Korea is now moving on from its 40 or so nuclear warheads and is working on miniaturized warheads as well as multiple warheads, that is MIRV missiles, and as well as tactical nuclear weapons, that is weapons, battlefield weapons that can be used without blowing up cities, but actually using them in battle. So the threat from, and of course their missile program is well known. They've got at least 3 ICBMs capable of ranging the United States. In addition to North Korea, they also announced that the Biden administration wants South Korea and President Moon Jae-in to jump more on board with the US policy in Asia, which is basically forming a new alliance of nations to push back against the encroachment against communist China. And so they discussed the ASEAN forum, they discussed the so-called Quad of India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. And they also discussed trilateral cooperation with Japan. We don't know all of the details, but from what I understand, South Korea is trying to play a halfway game. They have much greater trade and interaction with China, so they're trying to, there are some definite elements of appeasement in the Moon policy towards China. When President Moon spoke at the post-summit press conference, the first thing he said was that they reaffirmed the strength of the alliance. So there's still a very strong alliance there. And again, he said the most urgent task for South Korea is denuclearization and permanent peace. So South Korea is pushing for the reaching of a peace agreement with North Korea. And the reason that this is problematic for the United States is because this would feed into the North Korean propaganda line. If there's a peace on the peninsula, there's no need for US troops there. So this would be spell the end. So the Biden administration, and as his previous administrations, are not really interested in reaching some kind of a comprehensive Korean War peace agreement. Let me move on. I wanted to bring up, and I'll finish up with this, some of the things that came out in the testimony from General LaCamera, the incoming USFK commander. He was asked in these written answers to question if he believed that sanctions alone will lead to the denuclearization of North Korea. And he said, no, economic sanctions must be combined with a greater whole of government approach, which includes all elements of national power to convince the regime to return to meaningful negotiations. he said he didn't know what was going to ultimately bring North Korea back to the bargaining table, but his view is maintaining a powerful, credible combat forces are going to be the key to that. Asked about China's policy towards North Korea, he said China's policy in the region is to challenge the US role and undermine its influence in Asia. China's strategy on the peninsula is similar to its efforts elsewhere. It's using all elements of national power and coercion to advance its aims. Ultimately, Beijing is striving to diminish and undermine the alliance between South Korea and North Korea by applying pressure on the South Korean economy and seeking to weaken public support in Korea for the alliance. So it's, I think that in summing up, I'd say that the summit was really a great get acquainted session for the new president and his administration. And I think it'll be positive going forward. There's going to be continued military exercises. And I think that, again, the South Koreans are very much more pro-North Korean engagement than even the Biden administration. But I think we'll probably see some more engagement with North Korea coming out of the Biden administration. So I'll stop there. Turn it over to Guy.
Thank you, Bill. Great. It's great to have you and also to understand the urgency of the situation, especially the proliferation of more nuclear arms being developed, especially multiple warheads is really shocking. This is a most serious situation. Mr. Guy Taylor, National Security Team Leader for the Washington Times. He's an award-winning foreign correspondent currently overseeing the Washington Times State Department and intelligence community coverage. Mr. Taylor has engaged in extensive international reporting over the past 20 years from Latin America to the Middle East and Asia, the Pacific. His exhaustive coverage of US policy towards the North Korea crisis has won accolades from across the political spectrum. His reporting on security, political, and economic developments in Mexico won the 2012 Virginia Press Association Award. His reporting on Russia's attempts to influence the 2016 US election was recognized by the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize and won that prize for distinguished reporting on the presidency. Welcome with me, Mr. Guy Taylor of the Washington Times.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jenkins. Hopefully you can hear me. If somebody, if you can't, then somebody will let me know. I want to just start out by saying what an honor it is to be here with Bill. We work together behind the scenes pretty closely at the Times, but it's always fun, Bill, to be on a panel with you. I more or less agree with everything Bill just laid out, and I'll try to put my own touch on a couple of things here and emphasize a few other trends that I sort of noticed in comparing this visit to the Japanese prime minister visit a month earlier with Biden, because there's always interplay between the South Koreans and the Japanese, and there's this sort of competition between Seoul and Tokyo over who's a closer ally with Washington, and that's always really important, particularly roughly 100 days after there's been a transition of power in Washington. I think this meeting, it comes at a sensitive moment away from politics, in that it's really still not totally clear what Biden's policy on North Korea is, basically beyond strategic patience, even though they don't want to call it that. Those of us who are multi-administration Korea watchers at this point can see that that's exactly what it is. They've lifted this pretty much from the W. Bush era through Obama, and now it's, we're going to keep pressure on, and we're just going to wait until the North Koreans are willing to have, to engage in multilateral talks again. This is really different from what Trump did, obviously, which was to try and shake the whole thing up with these direct top-down summits with Kim Jong-un. So, this is sensitive because I don't think that, despite the really positive camera sprays and handshakes, I don't think this is really aligned with the Moon administration and what will really be the final year of the Moon administration in Seoul. because Moon wants to engage directly with the regime in Pyongyang and wants to get a green light from the Biden administration to do that. It's not clear based on what we saw publicly and from what I've heard privately. I actually think this did not happen, but it's not clear really if Moon got what he wanted. And what he wanted going into this was a green light from Biden to try and keep on pursuing, South Korea's own bilateral direct relations across the DMZ. And he wanted really tacit permission from the Biden administration to use certain carrots that could potentially draw the North Korean military into a renewed round of talks. And these carrots would look like probably humanitarian aid offers from Seoul to Pyongyang that are not going to be talked about publicly, and possibly some other kind of economic incentives. Excuse me, I'm getting a little bit of audio, like maybe there's another participant who needs to be muted.
We ask all participants, please mute your microphones. All participants, please mute your microphones. Thank you. Go ahead, Guy.
Seems to be passing. Thanks. So, we did not see that the depth to which that conversation went on, but it looks like it didn't happen. It looks like, based on what Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, went on the American talk shows on Sunday after the Moon visit, and basically gave a blanket statement that said the administration's position was the same after the Moon visit as it was going in, which was this broad idea that pressure will remain on North Korea with sanctions, and that the administration has tried to reach out through back channels to get communications going with Pyongyang to try to get talks going, but that the North Koreans haven't responded, and that the ball is now in North Korea's court. So that to me indicates that that the Biden administration is pretty much where it was before Moon visited, and nothing new there. I think that there's still this consensus at the moment. It's not agreed to by everybody in the American intelligence community, but there is this consensus that Pyongyang is close to engaging in some kind of provocation. We don't know if it's going to be tomorrow or next week. We don't know if it's going to happen, but more people believe it's about to happen than not. And the presumption is it'll probably be a submarine-launched ballistic missile. And we don't know when. And my prediction is that the Biden administration won't respond very aggressively. It'll probably hope that it's a one-off move, and then maybe level some kind of sanctions. The hawks in Washington will call on Biden to do something big, like sanction some Chinese banks that are holding and moving money for the North Korean regime. I doubt that will happen. Donald Trump also did not engage in that type of secondary sanctions. But I want to move to a second piece of this Moon Biden summit that I think was really important, because speaking of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, there is another authoritarian power in Northeast Asia that actually already has a whole bunch of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, including ones that could reach Alaska, and that's China. And China, this is where I'll diverge a little from Bill on this and kind of dive into the geopolitics of the Moon meeting in a way that just has to do with China. The Biden administration, based on my conversations with people on the Blinken team and on Biden's national security team, their goal going into this summit with Moon was to try to convince Moon to stand at a podium with Biden and give a joint statement that actually had the word China in it, that would actually criticize China. Because the feeling in the administration is that the Chinese economic instrument of power has grown so much, so quickly, even in the COVID era, in the last 5 years, that China is just wielding economic power over everybody in the region at this point, and that South Korea is facing more and more pressure. We have examples of the pressure that the Chinese have tried to put on the South Koreans to get them to acquiesce to China's position vis-a-vis North Korea, vis-a-vis the United States, all kinds of things. So the idea that Moon Jae-in would come and give a statement with Joe Biden criticizing China, that would be a success for Biden, because Biden, despite being, I think, openly softer on China than Trump, Biden has come in the first 120 days at this point. I think he's come forward and said that the United States and his government will try to stand up the Quad, Japan, US, India, Australia, and possibly even the Quad Plus as a sort of alignment of powerful capitalist, free market, freedom-loving democracies, almost all of them in the Indo-Pacific, as a sort of counterweight to China's rising power. And this is important because Biden, they wanted a signal from Moon that South Korea might actually join a Quad Plus or agrees with this initiative. And when it really came down to it, I actually just went back and looked again at the statement, the joint statement that came out. It barely has the word China in it. China is actually never mentioned directly. The South China Sea is. So Biden failed on that. And then I think the statement, it offers some platitudes about the rule of law of the sea in the South China Sea, but overall, it really wasn't that harsh on China, particularly if we compare the wording of it to the wording of the joint statement between Prime Minister Suga of Japan and Biden just about exactly 1 month earlier in April when Suga was at the White House. That statement directly mentioned China. Suga appeared to be ready to be out in front, really criticizing China, saying, hey, you can't put hundreds of fishing boats in disputed territories. You can't threaten Taiwan as if you're about to redo the early 1950s Taiwan Straits crisis. You can't pass a draconian security law in Hong Kong. All of this stuff was in the Biden-Suga statement. It wasn't in the Moon statement. This is important because just to take it a step further, Moon then flew back to Seoul, and while the U.S. media didn't cover it too closely, he's basically faced a barrage of criticism from China for the last few days because the Chinese government feels that he went too far in his meeting with Biden. So you can imagine that Moon really didn't win either. He thought that he could not criticize China, do this statement, got back to Seoul. China says you went way overboard. There's an editorial today in the Korea Times, obviously not a government editorial, but it makes it clear that that there's a lot of behind the scenes maneuvering by Moon this week to try to convince the Chinese that, hey, everything's okay. Please don't try to exact some kind of economic punishment on us because we went to Washington and are still allies with the United States. So that's a kind of interesting piece of the whole thing. I think that we have to take China into consideration with any of this. I like what Bill was getting into, and I hope in a Q&A here we can explore this a little bit more. And I'll conclude with the reason why I think we have to take China into consideration when we're looking at the Northeast Asian dynamic, whether it's Japan, South Korea, North Korea, or all together. It's really because of domestic American political trends right now. Almost every single foreign policy issue for the American government at the moment is politically divisive or being politicized, often by the left, but also sometimes by the right. And we could see that with the Israeli-Palestinian violence of the past few weeks, with attempts on the left to try and go after Biden from his own left flank, and also attempts on the right to basically accuse the left of politicizing every aspect of the thing. And the right aligning with Israel while the left aligning with Palestinians. We saw the same thing with the Iran, Biden's pursuit of renewed Iran talks, et cetera. Right now, with the U.S.-China policy, we have this window of bipartisanship. At least on the surface, it appears that a consensus in both parties understand the gravity of the situation and agree that the United States needs to have a China policy that transcends a party and transcends administration. And this is really important because when the South Korean ally is right in the middle of this, being pressured by China, and they come to Washington to meet with Biden, there needs to be an understanding of where the two parties stand on this, and an understanding of how deep the U.S.-South Korea relationship continues to be. So with that, I'm gonna stop, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A here, and hopefully we get some interesting questions.
Thank you, Guy. Bill, go ahead and respond. Let's put all three of us on the screen. Very good. Go ahead and respond to Guy's, remarks.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with it. I think it was a very good deep dive on the issue. And yeah, and again, China is really the backstop to all of this. China is trying to become the new superpower. Xi Jinping has enunciated the so-called China dream. And clearly what China wants is vassal states around its periphery. Right now, China is surrounded by hostile states. They have India, they have Australia, they have Japan. And so they see opportunities in trying to influence the Moon administration to play a greater role. The relationship between China and South Korea, according to General LaCamera, is delicate. And they're both looking for their economies to recover in the aftermath of COVID. And again, China is South Korea's top trade partner for both exports and imports. And they've had high-level discussions this year on how to keep them stable. The South Koreans, however, remember what happened when they agreed to deploy the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD. China basically launched information warfare against South Korea. And so the South is, they're trying to work closely with their US ally, but at the same time, they're keeping an eye on how to preserve their economic relations with Beijing.
We have some questions coming in. Guy, President Biden, right after he spoke with Premier Xi Jinping earlier this year, the very first time they spoke by the phone, he said to the people gathered there afterwards, if we don't get moving, they are going to eat our lunch. Then he talked about infrastructure and other things. What was the president referring to when he said they're going to eat our lunch? Was he talking about infrastructure?
Yeah, I think he was talking about infrastructure, and I think that, I mean, in some sense, he was making a domestic political push for his infrastructure bill, because as we can see, as we head towards the midterm elections, I mean, once you get through the first 100 days with an administration, you get a little window of heavy politics, which we're starting to see right now heading into the summer, where, are the Democrats going to try to pass something big here? It doesn't look like they are, but then before you know it, we're going to be heading. Getting a little bit more background on
everybody, please mute your microphones.
Go ahead, Guy.
So we're then going to be heading into the midterms, and I think Biden was making a pitch for his infrastructure bill. This is becoming. This will be like healthcare for the Obama administration, right? This is going to be Biden's thing. So yeah, he was speaking of infrastructure, but if you're listening between the lines, the other thing he's talking about actually does touch into the national security and tech and intelligence realm, because for a certain community, he's also talking about AI, artificial intelligence, and he's looking out at the 21st century, or at least the people advising the president, and they're beyond party, right? They're advising him, and they're saying, look, we're at 2021, and before you know it, we're going to be at 2040. And the GPS systems in the sky are going to be controlled by those who have the most advanced technology. And the Chinese are investing tons of money in that, in their own programs, and they're stealing secrets, they're stealing technologies. American firms are over-invested in that part of the world, not that part of the world, but in China for manufacturing specifically. That was sort of, if you're looking for a dog whistle of what else was Biden getting at, it would be would be that the United States needs to get very serious about investing. And I think Biden's pitch is, look, the Democrats control two of the houses of the U.S. government at this point, the executive and the legislature, and they want big government spending to invest in things. So that's really what he's trying to say. I think when it comes to then the geopolitical security dynamic with North Korea, South Korea, and China, this is a different issue, because the Biden, we have yet to see whether Biden adheres to what has been a Democrat Party foreign policy mantra for 15 years, which is that the only way to make any progress on the North Korea issue is through Beijing. That somehow, we heard this for 8 years through the Obama administration, that somehow the only way we could ever solve the North Korea issue is if the Chinese start helping us out a little bit. The Chinese did their part. And we remembered John Kerry traveling to China saying, we don't want to talk about the North Korea issue, but we could do something on climate change together. And that could be a start to maybe getting the Chinese to help the United States on North Korea. I don't know that Biden sees the issue that way. I presume he probably does. I'm sure Bill has thoughts on this. I think it's a very good question that we have to be asking, which is, what benefit is it for China, for North Korea to have nuclear weapons? What really is the Chinese strategic interest here? Does the Chinese government, has it made a clear decision on whether it wants denuclearization or not? And I'm sure, Bill, you've probably got, I know you got into this a little in your opening remarks. It's a really important question. I don't think we have a clear answer for it in Washington at this point.
Thank you, Guy. Bill, if you could unmute, I'd like to ask you to respond to that question that Guy just brought up, and that is, does the Biden administration and does China really want to commit to the denuclearization of North Korea? Let's start with China. That was the part of Guy's question just now. Does China really want to, in our fact finders with the Washington Times, we found from many different sides that it was absolutely clear China did not want a nuclear North Korea that they might not be able to control in a flash reaction to something. What's your thoughts on China's position on nuclear weapons, and is the Biden administration committed to CVID or CVD?
Yes, the official U.S. intelligence position is that China wants the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But in fact, I think that they're having a double standard on that they really don't. I think that they'll play along with that, and that they want to pretend that they can get this process going. The nuclear process has been ongoing for many, many years, probably more than 20 years now. I mean, going back, I can remember the agreed framework in '94, which was hailed as the great breakthrough that North Korea would denuclearize in exchange for getting civilian nuclear technology, which it promptly turned around to use for nuclear weapons development. And next thing you know, when they were called out on it, they withdrew from the agreed framework. And now we're in the current situation where they've got 3 ICBMs that they can launch at the United States. And there's no question that China was instrumental. China has never been held to account for the fact that they were directly responsible for providing the materials and know-how for that nuclear weapons and missiles. We don't have clear details on what the support was, but it's clear to me that the Chinese were implicitly behind it. So I think that Beijing has made a decision that North Korea is not going to denuclearize. The Kim regime views nuclear weapons as the sole guarantor for that regime remaining in power. And that's the main reason the regime exists, to hold on to power. So the prospects for getting North Korea to denuclearize through some diplomatic breakthrough are very unlikely. Oh, and if you hear any background noise behind me, the Blue Angels are practicing for the Naval Academy commissioning this Friday. So we've had Blue Angels flying over our house all day.
Oh, thanks. There is some technical issues with some sound going off in the back, and just let's ignore that. Again, I ask all of our audience to mute, and I ask our tech team to please look into why we're getting a continuous tone here. So let's go forward. Here's another question. What would happen if North Korea were to again start testing nuclear weapons? What's your prediction of the response of the Biden administration, Guy?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think what we would see is a immediate I know what we won't see. We won't see an escalation of the rhetoric that we saw after the sixth nuclear test at the start of the Trump administration, that was when we very quickly got to fire and fury. The world, if there's another nuclear test, the world will see fire and fury like it's never seen. That was where things went quickly. We won't see that from Biden. I think what we will see is an attempt at hard rhetoric, and then we'll see a combination of responses. And some of them will be we won't see because they'll be clandestine. You'll see potentially more things like the big power outage that happened a couple of years ago in Pyongyang. You'll see attempts by the U.S. intelligence community to try and undermine North Korean nuclear activities with clandestine hacking and things like this. But I also then think you'll see some kind of sanctions announcement. That's what the Biden administration will do. If the first 100 or so, 120 days have been any indication in other areas of foreign policy, the knee-jerk response from the administration so far on just about everything is let's level some more sanctions. And that's what you'll see. And then the debate will quickly come about in Washington over sanction what and sanction whom. And will it be companies that are feeding the North Korean nuclear program somehow? A lot of those already are sanctioned, supposedly. But or will it be Chinese banks that are or Chinese companies that are involved in supporting that activity? And that's an unknown. I don't know whether the Biden administration will do that. I'd like to hear what Bill thinks.
Bill, we have another question, but go ahead and respond to Guy's thoughts on.
No, I agree with that too. Yeah, that's exactly how I think in a lot of ways the Biden administration is very much, other than as we had talked about China, it's the Obama 2.0 foreign policy, which again emphasizes diplomacy and alliances. And basically that has the tendency to be perceived, rightly or wrongly, as weakness, and weakness is provocative. So that's created, I think, a very dangerous situation in the world.
So yes, the Biden administration through Secretary of State Blinken has indicated there's a strong concern about China. There's been mention of the building the bases in the coral reefs of the South China Sea and trying to restrict naval traffic there. But is this just an act by the Biden administration to look strong? But the real goal is another phase of strategic patience, waiting it out. Is there any possibility of real dialogue with Kim Jong-un? Is there, and that's good. And following up to that would be, who are the key players now? Help our audience understand who are the key players now. So first of all, is falling back into strategic patience of the Obama administration likely to happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. Sanctions, it's continued pressure. The idea is that sanctions are supposed to pressure it. Obviously, sanctions are not going to bring them to the negotiating table. It will, unless the sanctions are tightened to the point where they really make an impact. And by that, I mean, if they can do things that will really disrupt the China-North Korea relations, that I think is the way to get sanctions to be more effective. They have recently named Sun Kim as the special envoy for North Korea. He was the ambassador over in Asia. And I think that that's a sign that they're going to continue. There's some certain continuity with the current policy. I don't know, maybe Guy wants to weigh in on that.
Go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, I do. I think that, you know, I don't like to just knee-jerk criticize Biden. I'm very critical, and there's a lot of things I don't like about what I see going on. What I try to do is understand how it is that his administration is rationalizing what its policy will be, who the players are, and how they're rationalizing it. And when they're sitting around looking at this, first of all, they haven't appointed an envoy for North Korea. They've just started to get around to the changes with U.S. forces Korea. They, unless we haven't had a U.S. ambassador to Seoul for the first few months of the administration. However, that being said, what has the Biden administration actually shown to the North Koreans out of the gate very quickly? And what they have shown is that the U.S.-South Korea military alliance is stronger today than it was 6 months ago at the end of the Trump administration. So while Trump was shaking the boat and doing some really interesting things with regard to the possible future of a breakthrough with North Korea, what Biden has done is very quickly come in and resolve the SMA special measures agreement, military funding issues with the South Koreans. Made it explicitly clear that as long as the North Koreans continue on the track they're on, the Americans aren't going anywhere militarily. If anything, we're going to be increasing our military footprint, even though there's a Democrat in the White House. You know, there might be some spending debates and changes there, but there's no talk anymore of U.S. forces are just about to maybe pull out of the Korean Peninsula. And that talk was in the air, feeding North Korean propaganda throughout the Trump administration. So despite these kind of overarching critiques and this narrative of, well, the Biden administration doesn't really have a policy yet, going back to strategic patience doesn't necessarily mean that the North Koreans have carte blanche to do whatever they want now. What it means is we're going back to a locked status quo, where the United States gradually increases its forces and is on constant watch, while the North Koreans clandestinely try to inch forward their nuclear and ballistic missiles program. So we're not moving towards denuclearization, but we're also not softening our positions suddenly.
And I would add to that too. Again, General LaCamera was asked what he's going to do to deter North Korea if he's confirmed, which he probably will be. And he noted that his force improvements would include more early warning and more missile defense. So conceivably, we could see more THAAD batteries going there. We could see perhaps more Aegis ships going there, again, because the missile threat from North Korea. So that's certainly going to be perceived as provocative by North Korea, which could then precipitate some type of provocations on the part of the North. Other things the military is going to do, they're going to improve training and readiness of the forces there. And also they're talking about moving strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula, including aircraft carrier strike groups, bomber missions, F-22, F-35 aircraft. And this again is going to be, again, to really bolster the alliance and forces to deter North Korea. The nuclear deterrence problem is really growing. The strategic commander has a real problem now. We're trying to deter Russia. Our nuclear arsenal is designed to deter Russia. It's now got to be reoriented and modified to deter China. And if it has to include deterring nuclear deterrence against North Korea, that also adds another layer of uncertainty to the entire nuclear deterrence enterprise.
Let's talk about Kim Jong-un for a moment. How strong is he now? And also, how secure is his administration? Is there any weakness there? Is there anything of concern. There was talks about his health and those kind of things. The key intelligence people that we had access to told us he was never ill and he was never about to die, and none of that. And most of the people we have relations with would say that he's more secure than ever in terms of his hold on everything in the country. And how about his relationship with China? Is he more secure than ever, Bill and Guy? And what's his feeling or relationship to China?
Yeah, basically North Korea, Kim Jong-un has maintained a stable grip on power, and he's in control of both the regime and the population. The regime is currently struggling with the pandemic, even though they've claimed they have 0 cases of COVID. They've closed the borders and halted international commerce, and that has really created significant economic challenges, which in addition to the sanctions. Again, they're continuing what they have described as an unprecedented development of weapon systems. So even under these conditions, they're still building up their arsenal. So that's a real concern, I think. And so far, he's rebuffed South Korea overtures to negotiate, but the estimates are that they're clearly, as Guy mentioned, they're going to do some type of thing. Could be a nuclear test, could be a submarine-launched ballistic missile test. By the way, I would note that the first reporter to report on the development of the submarine-launched ballistic missile capability by North Korea was the Washington Times in one of my stories. And I remember at the time talking to a number of admirals, former admirals at the time, who just totally dismissed the idea that North Korea had the capability to develop a submarine-launched ballistic missile. And the fact of the matter is they're moving ahead with the deployment of that missile.
So, Guy, what's Kim Jong-un's relationship with Xi Jinping? Is it a positive, or is it only by necessity?
Well, I'll try to get at that from the big picture in a second, but from the more granular level right now, or in the last couple of months, it was interesting after Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan made their initial trip to Tokyo and Seoul back in March, and then they skipped stopping in Beijing. They stopped in Alaska and somehow convinced the Chinese to send their diplomats to Alaska to meet with them. And then they had this almost angry press conference between the two sides. Right after that, the Chinese government sort of propaganda machine went bananas with, sorry for my metaphor, but really went after it by showing how close that Xi Jinping actually was with Kim Jong-un. It was, I think, a week afterwards, there were statements out of Beijing and out of Pyongyang that the China-North Korea economic relationship was strong, that China would offer support for North Korea in the COVID era, that, you know, this was after also Kim Jong-un had given his party speech at the beginning of the year, making statements about potential struggles in the North Korean economy going forward. So then to the big picture, I think the relationship is strong. I mean, I think that I agree with everything Bill has said here today, that the Chinese government is potentially wary of a nuclear armed North Korea, is concerned, knows that Kim Jong-un and his regime are not a puppet of Beijing, and has some strategic benefit in supporting North Korea, but also that strategic benefit comes with a whole world of risks. But I think overall the connection is positive. We don't see friction right now. What we don't see is the Xi government making any angry or aggressive overtures in its public statements about North Korea. And that I think is telling in and of itself of where we are right now in the relationship. Does that mean that Kim Jong-un is on the phone with Xi Jinping? Not necessarily. I think that I like to call it the Kremlinology of trying to figure out the machinations of the Kim government. I agree. I think Kim is strong and in control of the messaging to a certain degree. I don't know how bad the COVID outbreak is in North Korea. We've done a couple of stories about COVAX and the World Health Organization's vaccine element and its relationship with North Korea. But the COVAX organization doesn't have enough vaccines to go anywhere at this point, and that doesn't mean that. I think there's a lot of murkiness and speculation. I guess I just got into it some there with regard to what's really going on inside North Korea. But when it comes to the China-North Korea relationship, no indications that it's souring at the moment.
And I would add that, there have been some recent high-level visits that shows that relations are improving. China's continuing to support North Korea with humanitarian aid, with military assistance, but it's not enough that Kim Jong-un wants. Kim Jong-un wants recognition of the nuclear weapons, which they haven't gotten from China yet, and it wants greater humanitarian and economic aid from China.
We have Mr. Al Thibodeau called in, and he's asking, the North Koreans have shown that they do not want to give up nuclear weapons. And from the time that the Soviet Union fell apart, our main concern was making sure nukes didn't escape to rogue nations. What about North Korea? Are we concerned that nuclear proliferation is occurring from North Korea to other rogue nations? And what would happen if we just not focus on denuclearization of North Korea, but focus on stopping the shipment of nuclear materials outside?
Yeah, big concern. I mean, North Korean nuclear proliferation is a real thing. There hasn't been any weapon system that North Korea hasn't been willing to sell. So that means that having nuclear weapons, that it would be capable of selling those to Iran, for example. We don't know what the status of their nuclear forces is. I'll go back to General LeCamera again, who said he was asked, one of the missions of the military in any conflict on the Korean Peninsula is to go in and get the weapons of mass destruction. And he ducked the question by saying, I can't answer this in an unclassified way, but he said, we don't have a real transparency about their weapons systems, but we are ready to go in and get their weapons if we need to. But if we don't know where they are, it's going to be hard to track them and hard to monitor them from being sold around the world.
Is there any? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, look, this is such a good question. I mean, because it really hits the bullseye of where the deep security threat actually is. China gave is a very strong word, but basically gave nukes to Pakistan. We could see that North Korea, there's a North Korea-Iran connection. Who else is North Korea sharing its nuclear expertise with? That's a question we don't hear asked very, very publicly very often, and it's a really important one, particularly when you look at how the geopolitical landscape, the power structure has changed in East Asia in the last 30 years. It's a completely different region as it was. There are several countries with vibrant economies and little power spheres that just didn't have them the way that they did before, whether you go all the way down to Southeast Asia and you talk about Indonesia, or you talk about Vietnam, or you talk about Malaysia. Some of these countries have close relationships with the North Koreans that are out of view of what the Americans are paying attention to, what we're looking at. And I think the question of, it's not a question of are the North Koreans sharing nuclear know-how, weapons making know-how with others. It's a question of who are they sharing it with, and I don't have an answer to that. But I that's why I think it is interesting, because are these countries? Is it just Iran that we always focus on? It's Iran. There's a connection with Iran, or is there a dynamic here where countries on China's periphery that are in play, so to speak, in this great power competition that that is talked so much about between the United States and China right now are these countries in communication with North Korea. Is there a possibility of a new breakout nuclear arms race in the region? These are reasons at the heart of why denuclearization on the peninsula remains a top level priority, even for a Biden administration, which has pretty much backburnered it for the first 120 days or so.
So when we see the South China Sea and the proposed restrictions by China on naval travel and so forth, the Obama administration was pretty restrictive of our commanders. We met Ambassador Harry Harris, and I've heard both sides that no, they didn't order the commanders not to say anything, but actually there was an understanding that they shouldn't say anything about it. And under Obama, then the Trump administration was quite strong about how that was a violation of the maritime law and so forth, international law. So talk about Obama's position on that, the Trump administration position, and where's the Biden administration on this?
Sure, I'll jump on that. Yeah, under the Obama administration, they had an appeasement-oriented policy towards China. And when the military proposes doing what they call freedom of navigation or freedom of overflight operation, under the Obama administration, they had to go through this laborious bureaucratic process. And the process involved getting the approval of the State Department. And that was the big challenge. In other words, these things, they would ask to do them, and it would take months for them to get approval to do one operation. The Trump administration said, we're not doing that anymore. We need to be in these areas, and we need to be declaring these international waters. And again, so China's trying to take over a waterway that sees 5 trillion annually in trade, and they're building up islands and they've militarized them. So they've launched aggressive freedom of navigation operations. They have them almost on a monthly basis. But the real good news is they started announcing them. And the reason they started announcing them had to do with a letter that was written a year ago, January. It was called the 36-Star Letter. And it was from 9 commanders, combat commanders, who wrote a letter to the intelligence, the head of the DNI, asking that they release information that will give them ammunition in the war of ideas, information about what these foreign countries are doing and about what we're doing to counter them. And I've seen a dramatic shift in that. They now will post, and the most recently, I did a story in the Washington Times on this. They announced completely with the legal justifications for why we did a warship passage within 12 nautical miles of the Paracel Islands, which are claimed by China and Vietnam, as well as Taiwan. And so I've seen a really positive result. Now, they've got to keep this up. If they go back to the diplomatic process that they used under Obama, which is entirely possible, and there's a number of reasons they could do that. One could be to assuage the Chinese on climate change issues. The Pentagon also wants to restart the feckless military exchange program with China, which ended up costing us a lot of really good intelligence. So hopefully right now the military is on autopilot and doing lots of very aggressive freedom of navigation operations, not just in the South China Sea, but also in the Taiwan Strait. We've made over 20 passages through the Taiwan Strait in just the last 18 months.
So, Guy, does the Biden administration fully support the Quad of the United States and Australia, Japan, and India?
Yes, I think philosophically, it very much does. When it comes down to an agreement on tactical maneuvers and putting some pressure on New Delhi, for instance, to get in the game and really participate with some military muscle in joint naval exercises, and also work with the Japanese on their Article 9 constitutional issues that create legal walls that Japan can't necessarily get over to participate in defensive exercises. that's a different thing. But when it comes to the specifics of the Quad, yes, I think that the real strategy for the Biden administration right now is to try and show Beijing that this is where things will go if you continue to escalate your provocations around the sea lines of communication, the so-called S-locks, that through which so much oil travels from the Middle East into Northeast Asia, through which 90% or 80% of Japanese oil goes through the sea lines of communications that pass, same with South Korea, that pass right through the Spratleys Islands, where the Chinese military has built airstrips and where the bulk of the provocations are. What the Biden administration, I think, is trying to do is say, look, if you continue with these provocations, look at the alliance you'll be facing. You'll be facing a military alliance of the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. It's not the style of this administration to escalate the rhetoric in that blunt way that I just did. But the message is very clear for anybody looking at this unfolding. And I don't think there's any question that the Biden administration is aware that it's crafting that message and it's trying to promote it, and did so very quickly by trying to hold a head of state meeting virtually of the Quad that seems to have gone quite positively. So I think we'll see more of that. And I also think that the Chinese government has realized that its criticisms of the Quad effort have largely fallen on deaf ears around the world. It's not as if everybody's lining up and saying, you're right, the Americans are trying to create NATO 2.0. No, in fact, most of the world is, in that, people I'm talking to in East Asia are looking at it and saying, thank God the Americans are actually standing up for something to show the Chinese government that this is a multipolar arrangement, and that we aren't going to roll over just because the Chinese have figured out how to spend more money on their own military.
Thank you, Guy and Bill. This has been an excellent session. We need to have one more very soon with both of you. We want you each to give a 1-minute short conclusion. What's your advice to the current Biden administration? And we're looking for the positive area. What's your advice, and how can they better work with China to bring about a peaceful reunification of Korea?
Yeah, I would just say that they need to really focus on the threat from China. I think that I agree that the road to Korean unification passes through Beijing, and that there needs to be pressure, the kind of pressure that's being put on North Korea, being put on China. It's not enough to treat China as a competitor. It's truly an adversary. They want to be the dominant power in the world, and they know that in order to achieve that, they have to weaken and ultimately defeat the United States. So I think that that's really the course. And I think that Korea remains a real flashpoint as long as Kim Jong-un is in power and he has nuclear weapons and missiles that can reach the United States. It's going to remain a flashpoint until we get them to denuclearize and give up those missiles.
Thank you so much, Bill. And Guy, what's your advice to the Biden administration on how to improve?
Well, number one, right now in the big picture, it's focused on the vaccine. Realize that there's no single world power that's going to get anybody other than the wealthiest, tiniest group of people in the human species vaccinated, other than the United States. Step forward, really focus on spreading the vaccine globally. Realize that if the United States doesn't do it, then Beijing is going to claim credit for it. The second thing is to stand firm in the big picture, to stand firm and do things like the Alaska meeting that Blinken and Sullivan pulled off at the beginning of the administration. Stand firm and really don't be afraid to try to rock the boat a little diplomatically. Not so much in a grand security realm, but I don't think anything other than good came from the Donald Trump term, with President Trump thinking outside the box, acting outside the box, and saying, look, these tired status quo things are not going to shape American policy anymore. that we're going to go after the same big picture strategic goals. We're just going to do it by thinking outside the box. So I would encourage the Biden administration to do that. And in my own conclusion, I just would say, again, it's an honor to be on anytime with Bill. It's always a learning experience for me because he's one of the preeminent experts and has been doing this longer than I have. And I appreciate it very much.
Thank you both. And thank you to the Washington Times for their support for this program. And we want to thank all of our audience. At this time, I'd like to bring the Senior Vice President of the Washington Times Foundation, Mr. Larry Moffat, on, who will tell us about next week.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Next week is a special one we do every month. It's the Washington Brief, sponsored by the Washington Times Foundation. Our host panel, if you will be led by Ambassador Christopher Hill, former U.S. Ambassador to Korea, South Korea, and currently distinguished professor of international affairs at Columbia University. Also, Ambassador Joseph Detrani, former special envoy to the six-party talks for the U.S., and also Professor Alexander Mansaroff, who's a professor of security studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University, and also a professor of Korean studies at Johns Hopkins University School of International Studies. He also has tremendous personal experience on the ground in Moscow and in Pyongyang. And the special guest for that will be Mr. Marcus Garlauskas, who is a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's International Security Initiative as part of the Atlantic Council. And for a long time, Mr. Garlauskas was served on the National Intelligence Council as the National Intelligence Officer, the NIO for North Korea, was a lead analyst on North Korean issues and directed the analytic interface with non-government experts. His analysis supported White House policy planning, including the 2019 summits with North Korea, Singapore, and Hanoi, and he's one of the most experienced pillars of the intel community in Washington, D.C. So it's going to be a fabulous it's a panel. It's going to be very special and worth attending. It'll be next Tuesday, this same time, 2 to 3 o'clock, and you'll get the links and the literature for it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.